Good evening, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Feel free to keep eating. I'm just the warm-up act. But I thought I would begin, as we like to do with everything at Road of Shalom, just with a word of Torah. If this talk tonight, I am really so excited for it, and it really feels more relevant than ever. I happened to be with our men's club last night at a lovely gathering, some drinks and drosh, I think it was called, and immediately afterwards, we woke up this morning and saw the horrific news of the, and I'll use the word pogrom, because I really think that's what it felt like in Amsterdam. And immediately one of the congregants who had been there sent an email to our group with the New York Times headline. And I'll actually, if you don't mind, I'll take it out because I was just looking at it. And the New York Times headline, the first headline that came out, said, "Violence tied to soccer game prompts dozens of arrests in Amsterdam." Anyone notice anything missing from that line? Anything about Israel, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred? Now, what I'll say is, and we try our best to give the benefit of the doubt, the New York Times did correct it and change it later. And actually, one of our congregants who was on the email thread with us, who happens to work in the media, said that, sometimes organizations want to get the word out so quick, they don't have all the information, and they're just looking to get a headline out there. Yes, and it's hard to think that's the only thing. And I think for many of us this year, it's been very difficult, and it's been very hard to kind of find the right media that we want to look at, that represents our values, that speaks to our language. Turning just to Torah for a second, we have a long history of sort of, I'll say maybe misinformation or hearsay or how things are reported, even in our Jewish tradition. And actually, we're about to read in next week's portion one of my favorite sections where Abraham and Sarah are told that they're going to have a child. And of course, Sarah laughs. Thus, this child is named Isaac. We're actually told that in this week's portion. And Abraham then goes, and it's when God tells Sarah, Sarah says, she laughed because she said, "How am I going to have a child with my husband so old?" Abraham then goes to God and says, so Sarah laughed. Why did she laugh, God? And God says, Sarah laughed, saying, "There's no way I can have a child because I, Sarah, am so old." And it's interesting. God spreads a little bit of misinformation. God actually doesn't tell the truth in that moment. Now, the rabbis point to that and they say it's okay in that moment because it was for the sake of shalom bayit, for the sake of peace in the home. And we know that sometimes we might fudge things a little bit. We might not tell a full truth for the sake of good. Unfortunately, I don't think that is always the case, and I think many of us, especially in the Jewish community this year, have felt that perhaps the media bias that we have seen has not necessarily been for the sake of shalom bayit. And I guess I present that to say that there are occasions, we even have it in our own tradition, but so much of it, I think, is the intent. And oftentimes, perhaps it is just a mistake. And when corrected, like with the New York Times, maybe they didn't get fully there, but in their later headline, they did mention anti-Semitism. I'm okay with giving people the benefit of the doubt, just as God, just as Abraham and Sarah do. But we also know that other times there's perhaps malicious intent in harming our community and trying to spread a certain narrative. And that's something we have to be incredibly wary of and vigilant about. And so I am honored that we are going to get to learn a little bit about that tonight with Lisa Hostein. And so I think I'm going to turn things over to our amazing, one of our co-chairs of our Israel Connectors Speakers Series, Elaine Crane, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Elaine.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight to join us. This program is being brought to you by Israel Connectors, which is Rodef Shalom's Israel Engagement Group. We are very proud of many of the things we do, but two in particular. One is the speaker series, and this is our third year of speakers, and Lisa will be our second presentation in this season. And also, Cantor Hyman referred to the upcoming visit of Rabbi Nir, who will be here for a week and a half doing all kinds of things. And we are very proud that Israel Connectors formed that bond with Akva Bekerem, which is outside of Jerusalem. That was one of our goals, was to have a sister congregation in Israel. So we're really looking forward to his visit. We are so pleased to have Lisa Hostein here tonight. Not all glass ceilings have been broken, as we know, but Lisa has broken 3, and I will tell you about them. She has more than 40 years of experience in the field of Jewish journalism. Her prior positions include serving nearly 15 years as the editor-in-chief of JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which is the global Jewish news agency based in New York. Following that, she served 8 years as the executive editor of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, where she also began her career as an intern when she was a senior at Swarthmore College, and she continued there as a reporter and news editor for another 10, and then returned, I guess, as the editor-in-chief. And now she is the executive editor of Hadassah magazine. I just want to give a little shout out for Hadassah. All the ladies and men who are here, who are members of Hadassah, please raise your hand. Okay. Okay, now, it was very interesting to me that every one of these news organizations is well over 100 years old. Believe it or not, the Jewish Exponent goes back to 1887, Hadassah to 1912, and the JTA to 1917. And Lisa is the first woman to be the editor-in-chief of all 3 of those publications, of those news outlets. She has won numerous journalism awards from the Pennsylvania Newspaper Association, the Pennsylvania chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the Philadelphia Press Association, and the American Jewish Press Association, where she has long served on the executive committee, and which also honored her with its award for distinguished service to Jewish journalism. She is a longtime observer and chronicler of political, religious, social, and demographic activities of American Jewish life. And she has traveled extensively and written about far-flung Jewish communities in Tunisia, Turkey, Argentina, France, India, the former Yugoslavia, and Romania. We'd love to hear about those on another night. Lisa lives in Bala Cynwyd with her family, her husband, Joel Ostry, who's here, her 2 sons, Sam and Ezra, and a friend, Lauren. We are so glad that they too could join us as our guests. Lisa, please do come up.
Yeah, no, I can use this. This is good. Yeah, I think that's just for questions. All right, good. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's so nice to be here. My goodness, Elaine really did her homework, way beyond what I gave her for a bio, but such a warm welcome. And honestly, it's just a delight and an honor to be part of your speaker series, and also just to be in this building. I think it's been a really long time. Probably at one point when I was at the Jewish Exponent in those various times, I'm sure I was here a couple times, and it's not a place you forget. And in fact, a friend of mine who's here, she said, we should take a tour. Do you have tours in this building? We want to have a tour. So thank you really all for being here. Really appreciate it. And Rabbi, you know, you kind of gave part of my speech away already. I don't know, you kind of did a good job. I don't really know if I need to speak anymore. But it's interesting that we had this conversation, and it's also interesting because, I honestly thought twice about whether I should really talk about this topic because I thought so many other things are on people's mind. And I also was thinking, I'm supposed to start with a joke, but I couldn't really find a joke that matched these times. But I really did want to just say thank you for coming at this particular juncture. There's my family and old friends and new friends and all of you at the congregation here, so I really appreciate that. So, this topic, actually, it's when I was thinking about it and trying to relate it, and a part of the reason why, I couldn't find a joke to match was, when you take like a gut punch in your stomach with, whether it's the elections or what's going on in Israel, it's hard to really know where to get beyond that. But I think it really is important, and as I was thinking about it, that there's a connection between these two issues, right? And it's about the media, and about how the media covers politics and how the media covers Israel. And obviously our main topic tonight is about Israel, but I think that there's really definitely a connection there. And there was obviously big news in Israel that for once didn't get a lot of play because the election was dominating the news here, but of course the entire Israeli government was shaken up when the prime minister fired his defense minister, and of course we always know he's a very smart guy, so of course he did it on election day, precisely so it would not get much play here, and he was successful in that way. But so Israel was going through its own earthquake. We've been going through an earthquake, and then, of course, as the rabbi mentioned, Amsterdam last night, which, it just, people always say to me, you've been covering the Jewish world for so long, how do you react to the anti-Semitism that's been going on this year? And honestly, I actually say exactly what Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who's the special envoy on anti-Semitism, says, and that is, I'm shocked but not surprised, but I am shocked. I mean, even having covered the Jewish world for so long, what's been going on this year has just been unprecedented in our lifetime, certainly. And the way it's being portrayed in the media, both the anti-Semitism and Israel, is a very important topic. So these issues kind of raise important questions. They force us to ask some tough questions. Are we getting the full story from the media outlets that we depend on? What do we do when we feel a gut punch by something significant happening in the world, like a brutal massacre in Israel or the outcome of a presidential election here, and we realize that the sources of news we've been depending on most of our lives to bring us full, fair, and balanced coverage haven't been fulfilling their promise? As we delve into the question of media coverage of Israel, it's critical that we keep in mind that the media landscape that exists today is so vastly different than what many of us once knew, and it's continuing to evolve all the time. So any analysis of how the media treats Israel needs to take these developments into account. So with those thoughts in mind, I'm going to address how the media in all its complexity tackles Israel, how changes in journalism have influenced that coverage, and why does it all matter? That's the perennial nut graph. Somebody here will recognize that expression that I always use. You have to say, why is this important? But first, I want to give you a little history. I'm going to assume that if you're at this dinner, you've kind of answered the question that was put forward in the title of this topic, which was, fair or real or exaggerated media bias. So I'm going to assume that if you're here, you probably are on the base level that there's some sort of bias going on. So whether that's been a long-standing worry or a more recent assessment on your part is going to vary from person to person. But you should know that this concern among Jews is not new. For decades, complaints about the way Israel is treated has been a topic of conversation, anger, and activism. In addition to countless articles, meetings with media officials, and individuals who have canceled their subscription over the years, 2 Jewish media watchdog groups sprung up decades ago and continue to be devoted solely to calling out what they see as anti-Israel bias. One of those groups, CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, was formed in 1982 by a teacher and social worker who was incensed by the Washington Post's coverage of Israel's first war in Lebanon. A second group, Honest Reporting, with the same mission, emerged in 2000 after the New York Times labeled a photo of a bloodied young man in Jerusalem as a Palestinian victim of Israeli police violence, when in fact, that young man was an American Jewish student studying in Israel who had been attacked by a Palestinian mob. Interestingly, how did the New York Times find out about this? His father saw his son's picture and quickly corrected the record. So needless to say, he was rather surprised by that. So why two organizations exist with similar missions, you might ask? Well, we are all part of the Jewish community, right? We know about that. The coverage of Israel began to shift soon after Israel's decisive victory in the 1967 Six-Day War. At that time, the narrative of Israel as the underdog in a threatening Middle East began to gradually change as Israel's military, political, and economic power grew. But why all this coverage of Israel? Why the double standard that scrutinizes its every move but gives other countries a pass? The simplest explanation of why comes down to one word: access. Israel is an open and democratic nation that historically provided the opportunity for reporters to dig deep in every corner of society. This, of course, was in contrast to much of the world, including the Arab societies, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Gaza, where press is largely not allowed and truthful reporting is often banned, inhibited, and often punished, sometimes by death. So when media outlets were looking to cover the Middle East, they sent their reporters to the only democracy in the region, a country rich with history and plenty of drama, where they could operate relatively freely. Even as many media outlets today have shrunk their global coverage, mostly for financial reasons, in any ordinary year, Israel continues to host hundreds of foreign correspondents. In 2014, when Israel was engaged with its last war with Hamas, there were 700 foreign journalists from more than 40 countries stationed in Israel. And since the Hamas terror attacks last October, the Israeli government has reportedly accredited some 3,400 journalists to cover the ongoing wars. As a result, the Jewish state for decades has been subject to disproportionate coverage. From the media's perspective, this scrutiny was justified, given Israel's role as a strategic democratic ally of the United States and as the recipient of $3 billion in economic and military aid annually, the largest beneficiary of U.S. foreign aid. Of course, we know another $14 billion was allocated to Israel in this past year. And as the center of three world religions, it also had an audience not only among Jews, but among Christians in this country. The New York Times, in particular, knew it had a large Jewish audience eager to consume Jewish and Israel-related news. Much of the criticism over the years has been directed at the New York Times. See, even the rabbi immediately went to the New York Times to see what they posted. It's still considered the most important mainstream newspaper, or what people now sometimes refer to as legacy. With 10.8 million subscribers, 10.2 of them, interestingly, of only digital only. So for many Jews around the country, the Times was a sacred and in many cases primary source of news and has been referred to in some circles, Jewish circles, as the Jew York Times. How many of you subscribe to the New York Times? How many of you canceled your subscription in the last year or so? Okay.
How many of us get it delivered in paper?
Yep. We're among those 600,000 that are still left. Right, exactly. Talk to my husband about that one. Right, exactly, right, okay. So media coverage grew along with the intensity of the Arab-Israeli conflict, first in the 1980s and the First Lebanon War, and later with the Palestinian uprisings, the Intifada in 1986, and then in 2000, Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, of course, was a big news story, as was Hamas gaining control of Gaza in its internecine war with Fatah, its chief Palestinian rival. It was also pretty bloody for those of you who are around to watch that coverage. Of course, journalists covered other aspects of Israeli society, but it was primarily the conflict that attracted much of the attention and the charge of bias. Yet during that time, as I was ensconced in Jewish journalism, but with a close eye on the mainstream media, I dismissed most of these charges and believed that too much energy was expended worrying about how Israel was being covered. In fact, I don't know, probably nobody associated with cameras here, but camera used to come to the expo all the time, and I, honestly didn't pay a lot of attention. I thought it was important what they were doing, but I just didn't buy it. I was a staunch defender of the New York Times and most other media outlets. In fact, I remember doing a big presentation at a big conference of Hadassah, probably like 20 years ago, with Ari Shapiro, who is an NPR correspondent, anchor, I think, at this point. And I was defending the media. Yes, as the rabbi said, there were problematic headlines or stories or other content here and there. Some of you may recall the controversy surrounding Tony Oth, the longtime Philadelphia Inquirer political cartoonist who was criticized for a lot of his work, but he was especially lambasted in the summer of 2003 for his syndicated cartoon that depicted a wire fence in the shape of a Jewish star. This was when Israel's barrier to protect against further terrorism was being erected. Enclosed in each of 7 sections, the 6 points of the star, as well as the center, stood groups of Palestinian men, women, and children. According to Oth, the drawing was designed to illustrate that the state of Israel is building a fence that separates Palestinians and is an obstacle to peace. Harold Goldman, the then president of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, was quoted in the Exponent saying, "The Tony Oth cartoon crossed a line between what is acceptable political commentary and satire to what is clearly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel commentary." Keep in mind this was 21 years ago. But despite these examples that existed, the fundamental approach to reporting from Israel and about Israel was, I firmly believe, at least intended to be fair and balanced. There is, by the way, no such thing as objective reporting. Fair and balanced has to be the goal. It's important to understand that completely eliminating bias in the media, especially unintentional bias, may be impossible. Even when journalists and editors actually aspire to provide balanced reporting, and there are, of course, many who still do, I really do believe, journalism is by its very nature a subjective endeavor. Determining what to cover, who to cover, what to include, what to omit, choosing the images and the headlines that accompany a story is still subject to human judgment and is not an exact science, nor could it ever be. Although there is talk of AI replacing journalists, and maybe it's already begun in some places. Throughout these years, I usually attributed missteps to reporters or editors who were either lazy, inexperienced, working against a deadline, or not knowledgeable enough to get all the facts and context correct. On balance, I felt you could trust most of the reporting. My thinking today is very different, and I don't think it's just because I'm older and wiser. So what's changed? I would argue that there are 2 major factors that tip the scale so that even longtime defenders of the media have long had trouble doing so in recent years. And both these factors have to do with the changing nature of journalism itself. First, you will find a different ethos and operating principle in many newsrooms of mainstream media outlets, in newspapers, broadcast outlets, and beyond. Second is the vastly expanded landscape that exists today. Beyond the legacy outlets, we find scores of upstarts, everything from Axios to the Free Press, and then, of course, we have social media, which is not, of course, journalism as we know it, but it has become what many younger people in particular, it's where they get their news. And these 2 factors are not unrelated, which I'll explain later in a bit. I'll come back to social media later also, but I want to concentrate on the professional side of journalism first and talk about that shifting ethos. Mati Friedman, a former reporter in the Jerusalem Bureau of the Associated Press, summed up the phenomenon in a piece he wrote just 2 months ago in the Free Press, which is a newish startup media outlet that has become a go-to for many seeking smart and balanced writing on a host of issues, including Israel. The most important thing I saw during my time as a correspondent in the American press, it seemed to me, he wrote, was happening among my colleagues. The practice of journalism, that is knowledgeable analysis of messy events on planet Earth, I love that definition, knowledgeable analysis of messy events on planet Earth, that's how you define journalism, was being replaced by a kind of aggressive activism that left little room for dissent. Friedman, who's a Canadian-born Israeli journalist, he's lived in Israel for many years, continued, the new goal was not to describe reality, but to usher readers to the correct political conclusion. And if this sounds familiar now, it was both new and surprising to the younger version of myself who was lucky to get a job with the AP's Jerusalem Bureau in 2006. The story I found myself part of proposed, in effect, that the ills of Western civilization, racism, militarism, colonialism, nationalism, were embodied by Israel, which was covered more heavily than any other foreign country. By selectively emphasizing some facts and not others, by erasing historical and regional context, and by reversing cause and effect, the story portrayed Israel as a country whose motivations could only be malevolent, and one responsible not only for its own actions, but also for providing the actions of its enemies. This, of course, was the refrain among those who in the immediate aftermath of October 7th claimed that Hamas's massacre was an act of resistance and blamed Israel. Friedman's assessment of media coverage of the Middle East conflict suggests what has become increasingly clear in recent years. A new generation of journalists are bringing their progressive values and values to their work and are having an increasingly significant influence on their editors. Now, this is probably a room where I don't have to convince you that progressive was not always a dirty word, right? It's not a terrible thing, and in fact, in many realms, a very positive force. But the glaring exclusion and or vilification of Zionists and Jewish voices from these spaces in recent years has forced a rethinking among many Jews. Furthermore, the experience Friedman recounts sounds similar to those of Barry Weiss, who is the Free Press founder, who in 2020 quit her job as an opinion editor and columnist at the New York Times, which she called an illiberal environment, where she was bullied by colleagues for not adhering to the orthodoxy that existed, and where editors and management allowed that environment to flourish. We saw a glaring example of that kind of environment in the widely reported case just recently of CBS morning show host Tony DeCopel, September 30th interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates is a Black, popular author and journalist who is promoting his new book, The Message, which devotes a large section to Palestine and compares Israel's treatment of Palestinians to Jim Crow laws. During the interview, DeCopel, who is Jewish, vociferously challenged Coates' views about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including his claim of apartheid in Israel, saying the book would not be out of place, if it weren't for somebody as famous, the book would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. After some CBS News staff members approached management with their concerns over the way the interview was conducted, DeCopel was rebuked on a newsroom-wide call, according to reports based on a video recording of the meeting, saying his interview had fallen short of editorial standards. And you probably saw it. It got a lot of media coverage. The internal CBS meeting, ironically, came on the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks, which sparked the ensuing wars and the intense media coverage that has followed. Clearly, it has been that coverage of this war that has sparked the newest round of dismay with many of the largest American media outlets. The focus on this news out of the Middle East is completely justifiable and necessary. We need to know what's happening there. The question is the lens through which it is being reported. The reporting of October 7th across most media outlets began in an earnest and I would say often empathetic way. It shouldn't be so hard to cover the story of such brutality and tragedy. There really were no two sides here. Networks and many newspapers, large and small, sent reporters to the scene. I was glued to CNN, also I-24, the Israeli broadcast station, for weeks, months, watching the horror unfold and the human tragedies of murder and hostages be told. But within weeks, sometimes days, depending on the outlet, the reporting refocused on the Israeli response to the attacks and the war with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and beyond. The media, for example, has been obsessed with the notion of proportionality of response as images, Hamas-controlled, of course, showed the suffering and mounting casualties in Gaza. We know of the basic problems inherent in this reporting, including reliance on misinformation and disinformation from Hamas, the death tolls from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, which is a US and European designated terrorist organization. I understand the dilemmas of news organizations. They want numbers, and Hamas is the only source in town. But without a reliable way of determining the accuracy of these figures, it's important to point out that in every news story, you have to point that out in every news story, that plus the fact that these figures make no distinction between civilian and fighter deaths, a point that actually the mainstream media to a large extent now has corrected and been inclined to include following a lot of protests. Also, what too often gets left out of the stories is critical context and background. For example, how the war started, who started it, Hamas's use of human shields and efforts to thwart aid deliveries, and most noticeably, the gradual omission of hostages, which I think should be mentioned in nearly every story and has clearly been a main reason behind Israel's actions. We know that 101 hostages are still being held. I think Sunday is day 400. Unthinkable. Sometimes the omissions are more subtle. An instructive example came earlier this week with the reporting of a strike on a center in Gaza where children were being vaccinated against polio. The headline in USA Today was, 4 children injured in Israeli strike near Gaza polio vaccine clinic, the WHO, World Health Organization, says. Only at the end of the story does it say that the Israel Defense Forces denies that it carried out the attack and that there were no strikes in that area, according to its initial investigation. Reuters, in contrast, goes with this headline, Israeli military denies strike on Gaza vaccination clinic. Neither report added the IDF statement about Hamas deliberately often shooting into civilian areas. And in neither case, nor anywhere else where I could find outside the Israeli or Jewish press, does it mention that this polio vaccination campaign, which is happening for the second time, was coordinated with the IDF, which imposed a unilateral 3-day ceasefire to allow for it to happen. At the same time, I don't want to minimize the amount of suffering that people of Gaza have experienced. One can take issue with the way Israel has prosecuted the war, but we also know that it would have ended long ago with the release of the hostages. Still, I am in the camp that in my mind should be a given. You can believe that Israel's war was necessary and justified, and believe that Hamas is primarily responsible for the devastation of Gaza and its people, and still mourn the suffering and loss of innocent lives on both sides. Keep in mind, for all those who feel that Israel is treated unfairly in the media, I need to mention that there are pro-Palestinian observers who claim the opposite. For example, The Intercept, an American news website that describes itself as left-wing and has been especially critical of Israel, published its own analysis of major media reporting and, I guess not surprisingly, concluded that the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times coverage of Israel's war in Gaza showed a consistent bias against Palestinians, giving little attention to the unprecedented impact of Israel's siege and bombing campaign on both children and journalists in the Gaza Strip. Indeed, media outlets for years, the ones that still even continue to include coverage of the world, still say that reporting on the Middle East is the most controversial and criticized of all their foreign coverage, with complaints coming from all sides. Now, when I once sat at the Jewish Exponent and JTA, and I used to get lots of complaints, it wasn't so much, well, sometimes it also involved right-wing, left-wing. We have a little bit of that in our community, right? And people were complaining, so I always used to say, well, if both sides are complaining, then I must be doing something right. And that was the argument for the long time in this instance about Israel as well. And I often did believe that it was true, but that was when I believed strongly, for the most part, the missteps weren't intentional or pervasive. But that has changed. It's hard, of course, to measure bias, but a detailed study by 2 Israelis of the current Israel-Hamas war, and they did a similar study in the 2014 Hamas-Israel war, concluded that the New York Times, the most influential mainstream newspaper in America, is biased. Now, one could suggest that as Israelis, they would likely be able to reach that conclusion, but their facts and analysis seem sound to me. In analyzing the Times coverage from October 7th, 2023 to June 2024, Israeli journalist Lilach Sigan, in collaboration with Professor Eitan Gilboa of Bar-Ilan Center for International Communication, not only looked at specific coverage, but they focused in part on the ideological and generational clash within the newsroom, which I find especially interesting and speaks to the different ethos that I was referring to. Not surprisingly, on the case early on in the war of the Al-Halili hospital missile attack on October 17th, 2023. In that now infamous instance, the initial headline on the Times website soon after the strike read, Israeli airstrike killed 500 at a Gaza hospital, Palestinians say. In fact, it was a failed Islamic Jihad rocket that landed on the hospital parking lot and killed 50 people. Even Hamas's Ministry of Health acknowledged that after Israel came forth with denying the claim and bringing evidence to the contrary. In addition, the report noted the Times took several corrections, initially marginal, and finally, only after President Biden called the headline irresponsible, did the editors make a more substantial correction. The Times admitted that it erred in relying too heavily on reports by Hamas regarding its use of casualty figures in the case, but the study says the practice did not change. The Bar-Ilan report also offers evidence of internal pressure the Times' young journalists apply on senior editors to adopt highly biased coverage practices and norms. One example involved the reporting of and the response to the paper's December 28, 2023 extensive report on Hamas's horrific sexual crimes against women on October 7th and beyond. This report, on the front page of the New York Times, included the story of Amit Susana, who was the first woman to publicly detail the sexual violences she experienced while she was held captive in Gaza for 50 days. I've met Amit. You have never met a more brave woman. She was the first woman to publicly detail some of the horrific things that she experienced. She's been in front of the UN. She's speaking everywhere now because, as she says, you can only imagine what the women are going through who've been there for 400 days. According to research by the authors of that Bar-Ilan study, the article, based on 150 testimonies and 2 months of reporting by a Pulitzer Prize-winning Times writer, was seen as damaging to the pro-Hamas cause by some Times journalists. They opposed its very publishing, and after failing to convince the editors to shelve it, they attacked the Times' credibility by leaking internal information to a radical left pro-Hamas media outlet and intimidated their editors. Overall, the 14-page report from Bar-Ilan asserts that the Times' coverage of the war demonstrates serious errors, inadequate corrections, serious omissions, and poor editorial supervision, adding these were not just sporadic failures. They seem to represent an endemic malaise. The Bar-Ilan study also, I found interestingly, quotes former and venerated Times reporters and editors who also are lamenting the shift. One is Judith Miller. I'm sure her name is recognizable to many of you, formerly a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter. She argued that the Times has, quote, abandoned its commitment to objective reporting, blurred the boundary between news and opinion, and shifted from being overtly liberal to an illiberal paper. She concluded that the paper I joined in 1977 is not today's New York Times, since the old Times was committed to covering news without fear or favor, and that while the Times still does some extraordinary reporting, it is doubtful that its reputation for slanted, ideologically driven journalism can be reversed. Miller's line that the Times still does some extraordinary reporting struck me along with her other obvious points. The fact is that the Times does do some extraordinary reporting, and that case that I mentioned about the sexual violence was one in point. But there's no question that that story should have been on the front page, and who knows whether other kinds of stories will be inhibited because of the atmosphere in the newsroom. I'm going to shift now to the emergence of journalists with an agenda. A shift from that to another significant change in the journalistic landscape, which is the appearance in recent years of hundreds of new media outlets, from independent journals to podcasts to social media. And I'm going to focus specifically on social media. And I have to tell you, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on this, but I found it really fascinating and frightening, so bear with me. We know that social media has continued to play an increasingly influential role as a source for news. According to a Pew report published in September, just over half of U.S. adults, 54%, say they at least sometimes get news from social media. Facebook and YouTube outpace all other social media sites as places where Americans regularly get news, according to Pew, but clearly those are not the younger ones. With about a third of U.S. adults say they regularly get news on each of these two sites. Smaller shares of the Americans regularly get news on Instagram, 20%, TikTok, 17%, or X, formerly known as Twitter, 12%. Let's focus on TikTok. I actually did a virtual program with people on this topic, and it was the first time, honestly, I really delved into TikTok. How many of you have never been on TikTok? I knew that was going to be the majority as opposed to, okay, how many of you have been on TikTok? All right. How many of you like TikTok? Ooh, wow, okay. There you go. You're allowed. You're under 30. You're allowed. While only 17% say they regularly get their news from TikTok, it is increasingly becoming a destination for news for its approximately 120 million active monthly users in the United States, according to Pew. 120 million people are actively using TikTok. That's a third of the American population. And an estimated 1/3 of those are between 10 and 19 years old. 48% of users 18 to 29 say they regularly get news on the platform and that keeping up with politics or political issues is a major or minor reason why they're on the platform. Another important point, US adults under 30 now trust information from social media almost as much as from national news outlets. Of course, that doesn't include my children. They know better than that. Now, why is that scary? I found an interesting article by a guy named Joe Berkowitz on a site called Fast Company. It's an American business magazine focused on technology and design. I had never heard of it before. But he conducted a fascinating week-long experiment getting his news solely from TikTok. He wanted to know, what does he miss when he's or not? So as he explained, there are two basic forms of news content on TikTok: video clips or screenshots that users repurpose from actual news sites, and people describing or explaining news items with a side air of opinion. I was less impressed with his conclusion. While he did say there were obvious downsides, and that's not all the posts were clearly dated, so he didn't really know when something actually happened when he was reading about it, and there were obvious omissions in the visual depiction, when he went back to see what he had missed in the more traditional news outlets, he said it wasn't much. That might be fine as far as the headlines go, but when you take into consideration how an issue like Israel and its wars with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran are being described, you can begin to imagine the impact these opinionated explainers can have on young, naive users, including college students. What's more alarming is that we know for a fact that Israel is losing the online advocacy battle. An analysis of online discourse on social media in the first month after October 7th, conducted by an Israeli company called Humans, found that there were 7.39 billion posts with pro-Israeli tags that were published on Instagram and TikTok. But in that same period, as opposed to the 7.39, there were 109.61 billion posts with pro-Palestinian tags, almost 15 times more. This was, according to several reports, a well-orchestrated and well-funded campaign. According to one of the founders of this Israeli company, on October 7th, the day the conflict began, we observed that 10 Instagram and TikTok accounts with 5 million or more followers began dedicating their entire feeds to disinformation and propaganda against Israel and showcasing atrocities from Gaza. The sudden transformation of 10 such accounts into Hamas propaganda pages in a single day created a trend, allowing it to gain worldwide momentum. It's hard not to conclude that there's substantial funding behind this operation. It's simply not feasible otherwise. The messages are too precise and the orchestration is too well timed for there not to be a financier behind these scenes. This is a carefully crafted plan that was already in place, and someone knew it would be executed. Given the data, just to think, in case you think that an Israeli was again biased, a writer at Intercept, that progressive outlet that I mentioned earlier, came to the same conclusion. People who get their news primarily from mainstream TV and cable channels are more supportive of Israel's war effort, less likely to think Israel is committing war crimes, wrote Ryan Grimm, a journalist at Intercept. But Americans who rely on social media, podcasts, and YouTube are generally on the side of the Palestinians. As I said, it's hard not to go down a rabbit hole researching all of this, but if you look at what happened and is still happening on TikTok, combined with the wide use of this platform as a major source of news among young people, you can get a better understanding of how and why so many in the younger generation have joined the anti-Israel forces. I'm not aware of any specific studies that correlate TikTok use and students on campus who have been most vociferous in their protests against Israel, but it would stand to reason. There's got to be a connection there. In addition to social media changing the way many Americans consume their news, it also has a direct but less understood impact on the mainstream media. The 24 hours news cycle, which has been around for a while with cable news, but add to that the immediacy of social media puts pressure on all journalists to get their stories out quicker, often resulting in less stringent reporting, sloppy headlines, editing with less concern for accuracy and content. So journalists are no longer just competing against other journalists, they're now competing against these opinion makers on social media. So why do all these changes in the media climate matter? I would argue that it matters for many reasons. I'll just cite two. Despite the growing distrust of the media, as many polls suggest, it is still influential, both the traditional mainstream media, the upstarts, and social media. I would suggest that a recent Associated Press poll that surveyed Democrats and Republicans about their views of the current Middle East war could be correlated to the kind of reporting that Democrats and Republicans are seeing and hearing. It goes without saying these days that we now live in a siloed world of media focus, where which channel you watch, or which newspaper, or which website, or which social media becomes an echo chamber, where people find the news they want to hear that is aligned with their political and social proclivities. Of course, there are many factors involved in the fact that segments of the Democratic Party have been leaning away from support of Israel in recent years. But you could also argue that constantly being exposed to liberal media outlets with biased reporting on Israel could very well influence their views on who's to blame. The second reason why this is important, and that has to do with anti-Semitism. While there's definitely no way definitively to determine whether the media has played a role in the surge of anti-Semitism, we do know that some mainstream and certainly social media have relied on Hamas, spread unsubstantiated claims about Israel's actions, and featured videos and reels that damage Israel's reputation. See what I just talked about before. Honest Reporting, one of those organizations that, I just lost my place here. One of the organizations that I cited before about the watchdog organizations, they talk about this issue, and that they also acknowledge that there's no way to correlate media coverage with the rise of anti-Semitic incidents. But they did discern some specific connection of media treatment of Israel in certain months where incidents peaked. I'm not going to go into some of those examples. So if you haven't yet figured it out, my answer to the question, is the media biased? It's yes. The bias against Israel is real. But maybe there's a silver lining here. Many of us find ourselves reading and watching media outlets these days that we rarely would have glanced at not so long ago. How many of your friends may be watching Fox News or reading the Wall Street Journal more regularly than they were before? If this leads us to becoming better, smarter, broader consumers of news, that's a good thing. I, for one, we already took the poll about the New York Times. I will continue to read the New York Times, despite the dismay of one of my sons, because I still need to see how they are reporting on the issues that matter to me and that I work with both professionally and personally. But I've expanded my repertoire. In addition to many Israeli and Jewish outlets that I've been reading for years, like the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, The Forward, JTA, Jewish Insider, I'd encourage you to look at all of these as well. I mean, who has time for all that, right? Forget going on Facebook. You certainly don't have time for that. I try now also to look at the Wall Street Journal, the Free Press, and the Atlantic on a regular basis. It's giving me a broader view, not just of Israel coverage, but also of America, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Do we have any time for questions?
I think we have a few minutes. Does this come off, or do I? I think you all can see how much preparation went into this presentation. So Lisa, we really do thank you for that, because this is not what Lisa does ordinarily. So that was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I have the privilege of asking one quick question first?
Sure.
You said that Israel is the only country in the Middle East there that allows the journalists in. One would think that would give the journalists something of a bias, seeing what a miraculous country it is, and yet it seems to work at its disadvantage. Could you possibly explain that?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting interesting point. It's a good one. You know, look, the media covers other parts of Israel too. We do all know what an amazing country and so many, you know, unbelievable things that exist there, the startup nation and all of that. When there's no war going on, that's what they cover, because if they're stationed there, they need to find other stories, right? So, you know, you do occasionally find those kind of those pieces about, you know, they talk about religion and, you know, the religious conflict, those kind of things. Look, I hate to say this because I'm a journalist, but conflict sells to a certain extent, and people, you know, that's what their assignment is basically. But you're right. I mean, and it's not fair to say that there are no either good stories or other interesting aspects that are covered out of Israel. That'll be my next talk.
I recommend Israel 21C as a source of all of the good news.
Yes. That is
Questions? Could you please raise your hand? David.
I'd like to know what your take is on Israel's denying Al Jazeera, which is an international news source, access to their country.
Yep, another good question. No. So for those of you who might not know, Al Jazeera, which is, you know, an international news source, was stationed in Israel. There are complaints that there are members and journalists who work with Al Jazeera who have worked with Hamas. You know, it's hard to know. It's not hard to believe that that's the case. We know that journalists came into Israel on October 7th with 8 p.m. We've gotten all kinds of stories about that. We know that the UNRWA, you know, UN folks have Hamas members who have been participating in both aid and terrorism simultaneously. So I don't doubt that there probably are some. It's a pretty extreme move to completely ban. And honestly, there's been a lot going on in Israel in recent years in terms of the media. And clearly during this war, I mean, the one point that I didn't make is, you know, the scenes that you are seeing out of Gaza, they're either coming from journalists who are based in Israel and who are only allowed into Gaza if they're embedded with the Israeli military. So they're also seeing what Israel wants them to see. But again, there's lots of like real evidence that they're seeing in the tunnels and things like that. Those who have gone into Gaza are very few and far between, and they know that if they show anything that is not approved by Hamas, that only shows the suffering, you know, who knows what would happen to them. So maybe a wishy-washy answer, but, you know, I think it's a legitimate question.
I was going to say that I heard reports and I read that the Israelis were not getting all the news and the visuals that we got. So I wondered, you know, what you think about that, if you think it's true, and if you would comment on that.
Sure. So the sense is, right, whether Israelis were actually seeing all the, you know, the horrific pictures from Gaza too. So I've talked to a lot of friends about that. First of all, they're all on international media. Like, I think it probably is true that the Israeli station maybe wasn't really broadcasting it to the same degree. But, you know, I have a friend who lives in Israel. She listens to more podcasts, reads more, you know, American international news than I do. And they all have that access. So, you know, I think it's a question, and I think it's a question that Israeli society is wrestling with. And again, depending on who you talk to, I think for a long time Israel didn't want to see, Israelis didn't, because they're still suffering, they're still traumatized, and that's going to be continuing for a very long time. So, you know, did they want to turn a little bit of a blind eye? Maybe. But I think now that's really probably not so true. I think, you know, again, ceasefire, not ceasefire, I think there's a real call among at least a significant part of the Israeli population to end this war as long as the hostages come back.
So I think you have provided a very accurate picture of the media, including not only the New York Times, but the Washington Post, to which I canceled my subscription, actually.
I actually did that too.
So, but the question I have is, what can we do about it, particularly with respect to young people, which is very concerning because, as you point out, they get their news from TikTok and X and all the social media that is even more biased than the print media.
Yeah. You know, I used to always tell people, write a letter to the editor, talk, you know, I mean, I think some action does have results. Like, again, I think including, like, you really do see in most stories now that, you know, that Hamas doesn't distinguish between fighters and civilians. You see that in a lot of the reporting now. So I think that, you know, it's kind of an orchestrated response. Like, if enough people take issue with particular things that are happening and they keep hearing about it, you know, it might have some influence. But I do think, unfortunately, that used to be more effective in the past, because now I think editors are concerned about this more, like, you know, agenda-driven news force and staff writers. Right, and social media, I mean, what people say about social media is you're better off not responding, because if you respond, then that just drives more traffic. And, you know, the whole way that TikTok works, you know, it's for you, and, you know, so everything comes based on what you're doing or saying. So that's the advice that I've always heard. I don't know whether anybody has any other advice, but that's not really. But at the same time, I will say, and actually when I was doing some of this research, I mean, TikTok has met with some, you know, ADL and other people. Like, there have been meetings of, like, Jewish organizational people meeting with some of these social media. Look, I do a program with Hadassah Magazine, a monthly virtual program. Very often in the last year or two, we've had a program that might involve anti-Semitism. And so when we want to post an ad on Facebook that says, you know, anti-Semitism on campus, we've been blocked. You know, so it's like it's almost like they're trying maybe, but then they're like going overboard, and then everything's political. So it's a real mess, that social media. It's a real, you know, blessing in a lot of ways, and a real mess too. And of course, you know, there are efforts to actually ban TikTok. You know, who knows what the new administration will do.
I know we could have many more questions for Lisa, but we have to wrap up. Before I turn the mic over to Ned Hanover, who is the chairperson of Israel Connectors, I just want to point out that on your tables are Hadassah Magazine, and Lisa brought them for us. Please feel free to take them home.
Thank you very much for the
And
plug. I was
Lisa.
going to give the plug too. I will say, you know, we don't traffic in breaking news, but we have really been devoting the last, you know, year and a half to issues behind the scenes, kind of in-depth reporting, you know, whether it's social issues or women, how women have been affected. We did a big story about the women observers who were not listened to when, you know, maybe they could have stopped this. So I do encourage you. I thank you all who are members, and I do encourage you to take the magazine. You can actually subscribe if you want to not be a member. Don't tell my organization that I told you that, but it is true. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So my name's Ned Hanover. I'm the chair of Israel Connectors. And Lisa, I just want to really thank you. I'm really appreciative of your coming to Bread of Shalom tonight and giving us your analysis on you know, media and where we get our information from, and you know whether it's biased or not. Clearly, it is. We know that it is. That's what we do with the information that really matters. I just want to mention a couple of things before we close, which is, of course, this program was brought to you by Israel Connectors, which is the connection group within Bread of Shalom that strengthens bonds to Israel. We have a lot coming up in the month of November. First of all, we have an education series that's continuing called I Engage, and that's an educational series that has, I think, 3 more sessions left. The next one is on Sunday morning, November 17th at 10 o'clock in the morning. Also, As you've heard a couple of times tonight, Tamir Nir will be visiting with us for about 10, 11 days, beginning basically next weekend. He comes to us from congregation or Kihilat Achva Bakerem in Jerusalem, and he's coming here on a fellowship really to learn more about how we function in American synagogue. So it's going to be a learning experience for him, but it's also going to be a learning experience for us as well. And in particular, I want to highlight the program that he's going to be doing on Tuesday, November 19th at 6:30 p.m., which is called, it's an Israel Connectors program called Strengthening and Progressive Judaism in Israel with the World Zionist Congress Election. And I want to talk a little bit about that just for one quick minute. Topic that you're going to really hear about a lot more as we go through the months of November, December. The World Zionist Congress election, if you don't know, is our chance in America and around the world to really participate and have a say in monies that go, how monies are spent in Israel, what kind of people, liberal or conservative, who gets elected to boards of very important quasi-governmental organizations in Israel. And you will have a chance to vote March through May. And if you want to hear more about that, because of course whatever happens in Israel affects us here, I think we all know that more than ever, then please talk to me about it. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Maybe if you want to become involved in the process, be happy to have you. And if you just want to read more, read my article that's in the November-December bulletin. There's some copies on the desk if you don't have one already. Thank you again for coming out tonight, and Shabbat Shalom.